Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to OVS's first financial resilience webinar, Creating a Fund Development Plan. This is hosted by Jennifer Amstutz and Alan Krieger, who are our consultants for the Training and Technical Assistance Request Program. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. Alan, if you could move to the next slide, please. The first item of note is that we have an ASL interpreter on video for today's meeting. If this is something you would like to make use of, please update your personal WebEx layout to active speaker and thumbnail or grid view. You can also pin Alita's video so that you're able to see her the entire time. Move on to the next slide, please. We would also like to remind people that if you are trying to listen into this, you need to access the audio. So to access audio for this meeting, please dial in. We have displayed the phone number and access code on the screen. The phone number is 518-549-0500. The access code is 171-625-5981.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, for getting us started. Welcome, everyone. This is, as Rachel referenced just a minute ago, Creating a Fund Development Plan. I'm Blake Cush. I'm the Director of Training and Outreach at OVS. And this past April, we hosted a webinar on financial sustainability for victim assistance programs, where we reviewed the current landscape of VOCA funding and its uncertain future. So we understand that this financial environment comes with many challenges, questions, and we're here to support you. So continuing that discussion, today's webinar is actually, as Rachel just said, our first in a series of the Building Your Program's Fiscal Resilience webinar series, which was developed with that in mind and trying to help you tackle some of these unique challenges. Each webinar in the series, including today's, is recorded, and then links are made available on the VAP Training Center webpage, as well as our OVS YouTube training channel. Typically takes about a day or so to get it uploaded for there. Finally, as soon as you exit today's webinar, you will be directed to an evaluation survey on the presentation. Please take a couple of minutes, give us feedback. There, you also have an opportunity to notify us if you're interested in receiving more training or follow up on this or a variety of training topics. You will be prompted, your web browser will prompt you saying WebEx is trying to redirect you to a website. It is a safe sender, it's a safe site to click through and actually give us some feedback. So today's webinar, as Rachel just mentioned, is led by Jennifer Amstutz of JA Strategies and Alan Krieger of Krieger Solutions. Both Jenny and Alan have more than 40 years of combined experience in consulting and training, working with nonprofits and agencies around the state of New York, and both have also served as executive directors of nonprofit organizations and each have master's degrees in management. That said, I'd like to formally welcome Jenny and Alan to get us started.
Thanks, Blake. This is just a quick review of the WebEx for those of you who haven't been on one of our webinars before. We know that for most of you it's old hat, but we're just going to do a quick check. If you click anywhere on the screen, you should get a menu that pops up that looks a little bit like the menu down at the bottom there. And you'll see in the middle there's a icon with a bubble inside. It's either blue or black. If you click on it, the chat box should open off to the right. And we're going to be using this for you to chat in any questions you have or any comments on anything we're talking about. If you look at the bottom of the chat, there's a to button, and one of the options in the drop-down menu is all panelists. And we appreciate if you could click that now so you're ready to go. By sending it to all panelists, you'll be sure that at least one of us sees that your question, because the person presenting will not be looking at the chat box. So this way you'll make sure somebody will see it. We'll answer some of the questions as we go along, and we'll take time at the end for any questions that we missed. During the webinar, you'll be given an opportunity to participate in a couple of online polls. When we open each poll, a box will pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll be able to click the answers. After the poll, you can click on the X in the upper right corner to close the poll results on your screen. So there's not much for you to do, we're going to give you about 30 seconds to answer the questions. Okay, so a few months ago during our sustainability webinar, we talked about the importance of diversifying your fundraising base. A lot of you here are funded mostly by grants, but in this unstable environment, it's important to have a diverse set of funding streams. to safeguard against losing too much funding from any one source at any one time. Today we're going to for your agency or program that will help you consider how to diversify your funding base. As part of this workshop, we'll look at a process that you, your board members, or your development team can go through to create the plan. That will include setting goals, looking at different funding channels, and creating the strategies and plan to get your funding needs met. We will talk briefly about how your strategic plan goals and your fund development goals are linked. And finally, we'll look at the components of the actual written fund development plan. We'd like to start this webinar with a poll and get a sense of where you are at in terms of your fund development plan. So we're going to do a quick poll here. Not all of you may be fully involved in your fundraising program, so answer to the best of your ability and let us know if you have a fund development plan, and if so, is it something you update regularly? Some of you may not have a formal plan, but you do have development goals, and for many of you, this may not be something you've ever done in your program or haven't done recently, so some of you may not be sure. If none of these answers really describe where your organization is, check number 5, Other, and then let us know in the chat box what you're doing. Again, make sure you chat to all presenters. So the poll is up. You got about 20 seconds left, so please check your answer, hit submit on the lower right side, and then we'll see what the results are. About 7 seconds, so please choose one and hit submit. Okay, the poll is closed, so let's see what the results are. It takes a minute or so to open it up. Rachel, if you could share the results. There we are. Okay, so a third of you didn't get a chance to answer. Sorry. But most people said D, not sure about not sure about your fund development plan. So a lot of you are hopefully new to this and will be able to learn quite a bit. About 10% have a fund development plan and that they update it regularly. 15% have goals but not a formal plan. And then 7% said basically they don't have goals or a plan. All right, and then and the ones who are not sure. So hopefully this will be a useful webinar for all of you. For those of you that have a plan and update it regularly, we hope we'll give you a couple of tips here and there. And for the rest of you, there should be a lot of good information in this. Okay, so once we've gone through all the steps and the components of a development plan today, you're going to see that it can be a lot of work. Therefore, we want to begin by discussing why you might want to create such a plan for your organization or program. I'm going to turn this over to Jenny now to talk about that.
Thanks, Alan. Actually, I'm going to answer 2 different questions for us today. The first is, what is the purpose of the planning process itself? Fund development planning is more than just creating a budget, and so I want to talk about why we go through this lengthier process. And the first reason that this is an opportunity to link what you do, so your mission, your vision, and your strategic goals, to your fundraising program. We're going to talk later again about how these 2 are linked, but it's important to remember that they are linked. The development planning process is a great way to get your board, your staff, and volunteers engaged in your fundraising, and it helps them set goals that are realistic. And by setting realistic goals, you'll be able to replace what I like to call magical thinking with an actual detailed roadmap to how you're going to raise the money that you include in your yearly budget. And so what do I mean by magical thinking? Many of us will have sat in board meetings or fundraising committee meetings where somebody says something like, wow, last year I know the Boys and Girls Club raised $50,000 for their golf tournament. Why don't we do that? Or somebody suggests a capital campaign to raise money for a new $500,000 building, but you aren't even really raising a tenth of that on an annual basis through your fundraising. So those aren't realistic expectations, but because people hear about them in the community, people get really excited about them. And so they think that that money is going to be magically raised and it's going to be a lot of money with little effort. So by including your volunteers and your board members and your staff in the planning process, they can be instrumental in setting goals that are realistic. And because they've been part of the process, to think through what is possible based on your resources and your current donors and your community. And once you have that roadmap, you'll be able to set priorities for how your staff and how your volunteers and how your board are spending their time so that they can meet those goals that you include in your plan. The second question I want to answer before we move on to the planning process itself is why develop a written fund development plan? If you've gone through the planning process and you've set yourself a fundraising budget, why do you actually need a written fundraising plan? And the fund development plan is important because in one place it tells you where to focus and it reminds you how you decided you would raise money based on your staff and volunteer resources. Because that's all in the written plan, it'll keep you from reacting when somebody suggests the fundraising idea of the month. So instead of reacting to every new idea that might come into the door or every new need that may be raised by a well-meaning volunteer or staff member, the written plan will keep you on track and it allows you to be proactive in building a solid fundraising base. And that allows you to build confidence in your fundraising program because you'll see results. But like a strategic plan, your fund development plan should not be something that you do once a year and then you let it sit on a shelf. So when we talk about the components of the plan, you'll see that not only does it include your fundraising goals and your strategies that you want to use to achieve them, it's going to include a calendar and a budget. So for it to be useful, it should be the actual roadmap that everybody is using to guide them through the fundraising calendar year. Like a strategic planning process, creating a fund development plan is the result of a fund development planning process. And the first time you go through this process, it may take you a bit longer than it will in subsequent cycles. Why? Because some of the things that we're going to suggest today may be things that you've never done before. We're going to talk about completing a development audit, identifying your fundraising challenges and opportunities, and really spending some time creating your key messages. You want to give yourself time to do all of these things well. The next time you go through the process, hopefully next year, you'll just be updating and refining this information, so it won't take you quite as long. The first step in the planning process is to do an analysis of where your organization currently stands related to its fundraising program. For those of you who don't have a program, and this is your first opportunity to dip your toe into fundraising, it's still important to analyze where your resources may lie. We want to start with your board. If you're part of a nonprofit organization, then it's generally understood that the main responsibility of fundraising lies with the board. And while that is nonprofit best practice, it's often not the case, especially in smaller community-based organizations. So start by taking a look at how involved your board is in fundraising if you do currently have a fundraising program. Are they helping you identify new donors? Are they giving to the organization themselves? Are they helping with any events you're doing, or are they actually making fundraising calls with you to ask for money? And if you don't have a fundraising program now, or you have a really small one, then you still want to look at your board and decide how likely you think they're going to be actively involved in your program. Are they going to give money themselves? Do they have connections to people in your community with money, or do they have connections to local businesses and corporations? Even though the board may become involved in fundraising, a lot of the work will still be left to the staff. So you also want to take the same hard look at your staff resources and expertise, especially since so many organizations with government funded positions have limitations on some of the activities like fundraising that staff can take part in. We want to make sure we understand kind of where staff are and what they have time to do. We touched on this when we did our sustainability webinar, but you really want to analyze whether you have the staff resources available to increase or change the way you are raising funds. Do you have any staff members who have the time or the expertise to be involved in fundraising? If not, do you have anyone who might be able to reallocate their time or might be interested in learning? Once you've looked at your human resources related to fund development, then you need to look at your infrastructure. We're going to talk later about the fact that an important part of fundraising is building relationships and keeping in touch with your donors. So you want to look at what systems and processes you currently have in place to do that. So do you have a donor database at all? Do you have procedures for thanking and keeping in touch with your donors? And then the final part of your development audit is to take a detailed look at your current donors, if you have any. So how many donors do you actually have? And it's good to go back a few years, especially because this year looks so different from the previous years. It's important that you have a couple of years of data to look at. So in addition to how many donors you have, you want to see how often they're giving and understand both the average gift size for your organization and also how many donors you have that are giving at lower levels versus how many donors you have giving at higher levels. And finally, you want to look at your return on investment by method. And what do I mean by that? That means really for every dollar you raise in revenue, how many resources were needed to raise it. So Boys and Girls Club may have raised $50,000 with that golf tournament, but may have taken 10 staff a month of full-time work to do it. So the return on that event is much lower than for an organization that maybe raised the same $50,000 by sending a letter and getting $500, $100 donations. So now we're going to click, we're going to now done the development audit, and you next want to identify where your fundraising challenges are. And many of these will have been uncovered during a development audit. Things like challenges with personnel and whether you have enough people dedicated to implementing your fundraising program. The development audit may have uncovered the fact that you don't actually have very good records of your donors at all. Maybe you're not keeping all of your donor information in one place. Some people keep their event attendees in one's Excel spreadsheet and keep their donors in another one. Your audit might have shown that you're attracting a lot of new donors through your events and appeals, but those donors only give once. You're not keeping them from year to year. During this part of the process, you'll also want to identify some challenges that might not have come up during your development audit, such as which of your programs might be underfunded, which are the programs that you want to expand your services, or maybe there are programs that you could use a few more discretionary dollars for items that are not covered by grants. In addition to challenges, though, there may be other things going on with your programs or agencies that present some fundraising opportunities for you, and you want to make note of these so you can take advantage of them when you're setting your fundraising goals. If your program has gotten some positive press recently and has been in the news, then that's an opportunity to reach out to new and existing donors. Maybe you're celebrating an anniversary or you have a new leader or executive director on board. Again, this is a great time to reach out to your supporters with that news. And finally, you want to connect your fundraising to when it's going to receive the most attention. For instance, because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, people might be hearing more about domestic violence, or they may be hearing more from your agency and from others. And so this might be those same people may be looking for a way to make a difference. So a fundraising letter or appeal done during October is a good way to both raise awareness and raise funds for your program at the same time. The next step in the process is now to think about your key messages and your case statement. People give to organizations and programs because they support the mission and the vision of the programs. So they give because they think that what you do is valuable and they want to help. So your key messages will be the themes that you want to return to throughout your fundraising year that gives voice to what makes your program compelling and what sets it apart from other programs in your area. A case statement or case for support is the document or brochure that really pulls those key messages together. The key messages in your case statement should outline what's special about your organization's mission, the people you serve, and your programs. And it should include stories about your successes. Good case statements sum up the need in your community, why that need is pressing, why you're uniquely qualified to tackle that need, and what the benefits will be from your programs. I'm asking you to think about your key messages early in the fund development process because it'll help you clarify in your own minds why people should give to you and what the best way to reach them might be. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alan to take us through the next few steps.
We shared this slide in our sustainability webinar, so it may look familiar. It's an important piece of the fund development planning process. During the planning process, you're going to create a calendar and an implementation plan for your fundraising appeals and events. In order to do that realistically, you need to know who you can count on to work with you on this. In addition, a fund development plan should be developed by the team that is going to implement it. So you need to think about who the team is going to be before you get started. Over the last few years, Jenny and I have worked with a number of victim service agencies across the state. We realize that many of the smaller agencies do not have dedicated fundraising professionals helping with the fund development plan. So if you don't have those staff, you need to think about who else will be part of the fundraising team at your agency and how much time they will have to devote to fundraising. As we talked about earlier, your board can and should be a strong resource in fundraising. And the executive director or program director, the face of the program, may also have a large role to play. But beyond that, do you have other staff that may be able to devote some time to fundraising? And is there a way to incorporate other volunteers who may not be ready to join the board but want to be involved? Create a list of those people, identifying who they are and how many you can count on. Think about how involved you want them to be. Are they going to be part of your fundraising planning team? Are they going to be on a committee? Or are they just going to help with some of your office tasks? And keep this list in mind as you create your plan. You only want to create as many tasks and responsibilities as you have people to fill them. Before we move on to actually setting fundraising goals, we want to take a step back for a minute and think about your strategic plan. Your fund development plan should be intrinsically linked with the strategic plan. The strategic plan provides the framework for your fundraising. As part of your strategic planning process, you're setting long and short-term goals for your organization and its programs. The role of the fund development plan is to raise funds and financing to support those goals. That does not necessarily mean that if you don't have a strategic plan, you shouldn't or can't do a fund development plan. Planning is always a good and useful activity. But it does mean that if you do have a strategic plan, you should make sure that the goals you set in your fund development plan complement and support the strategic plan and don't work at cross purposes. Now it's time for your fund development committee or the people developing the plan to set your fundraising or fund development goals for the year. If you've done any training with us, then you'll not be surprised when you see that we've included SMART again. Your fundraising goals should be specific, measurable, attainable, and relevant. And generally, they're completed in 1 year. The goals here need to be specific because your committee needs to know exactly what it is they're aiming for. Are you trying to increase the number of donors you have, increase the average donation, or are you aiming to increase the overall amount of money you raise? They should be measurable. If you're increasing the number of donors, then you want to include by exactly how many donors. If you're increasing your average donation, then by what percentage are you increasing it? If you're increasing the overall amount of money you raise, are you doing that by 10% or 20%? Attainable is one that I really want you to think about as you develop your fundraising goals. I want you to think back to the conversation earlier about magical thinking. We often read fundraising goals that have more to do with magical thinking and less to do with realistic, attainable goals. We often like to think that we're going to be able to double the amount of money we raise in a single year. Unless you have raised very little in the past or are dedicating a lot of new resources towards the fundraising process, then that may not be an attainable goal. So set goals that may take some work but are realistic. And finally, relevant brings us back to our previous slide about the strategic plan. Are your fundraising goals relevant to the overall mission and goals of your organization? We've included time-bound in parentheses here because your fund development plan is usually an annual document, and so the goals are usually a year in length. However, if you have a longer or shorter goal in mind, then you want to specify that as part of your fund development goals. Here are 3 sample fundraising goals. The first one, raise $10,000 in individual donations in 2021, is specific because we're talking about individual donations. It's measurable by including the number of dollars that need to be raised. Whether or not it's attainable, though, is really up to the organization who set the goal. Did they raise $8,000 last year or only $1,000? The next one is a little easier to assess in terms of attainability. We're increasing the number of donors, so that's a specific act. We're going to increase them by 10%, which is both measurable, as long as you know how many donors you had in 2020. And while 10% may be a stretch goal for many organizations, it could be realistic. The last goal is measurable. Create a new event to convert volunteers to donors. If the event happens, then you have achieved this goal. But there may be some room to make it more specific and more measurable. Maybe change it to create a new event that converts 20 existing volunteers to donors. That is to say, 20 volunteers may never have given money to the organization before, but they do after the event. We can only know if this is attainable if we know how big an event is planned and whether there are enough staff and volunteers to put that event in place. The goal setting process helps create a realistic fundraising mix for your program. In addition to the government sources that you have, Revenue can come from grants, corporate sponsorships, individual giving programs, and events. You want to create a mix for your organization that will help you achieve your fundraising goals and your strategic plan goals while keeping in mind the staff and volunteer resources that you have available. At this point, I'd like to revisit another slide from our sustainability webinar that as a reality check. Who is actually giving money today and in what percentage? It's important to remember these numbers when creating fund development plans and your fundraising mix. Often we think of foundations and corporations as easy money, and in some ways they are. With one grant request or maybe one letter to a corporation, you can receive a sizable donation or grant. But if you look at this chart, it will show you what percentage those two sources make up of all the private contributions in 2018. Corporations made up only 5% of all private giving, foundations only 18%. That means more than 75% of all giving came from other sources, came from individuals through donations and bequests. So we're not going to spend much time today talking about either foundations or corporate sponsorships. We'll do a grant writing webinar on December 1st, and we'll talk a little bit more about those two strategies then. Instead, today we're going to focus on individual giving because that makes up just about 70% of all giving in 2018. And the good thing about individual giving is that, for the most part, it's a way to raise funds that are not earmarked for any specific program. You can receive ongoing and reliable dollars on a year-to-year basis. And it's a great way to build support for your programs through the community, through the relationships you have with your donors. And turn this back to Jenny now to talk about individual giving.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. So your individual giving program can be split into two different categories. Those types of giving, the type of giving when you're soliciting money directly from your donors, and individual giving programs when you're raising money through events. So I'm going to start first with your direct giving program. So direct solicitation can take many forms, but generally those can be categorized into face-to-face meetings, phone calls, letter solicitations, and online solicitations. Face-to-face fundraising is the most effective of all your fundraising methods because people are more likely to give when they're sitting in front of you. It's really hard for people to say no face-to-face. So gifts are often larger, and it can be a really good way to get your board members involved. And face-to-face solicitation is the least expensive way to raise money because it requires mostly time to do a little research and time to set up and attend the meeting. But face-to-face meetings, especially those that are in person, are certainly more challenging this year than they have ever been. And you need to have well-prepared solicitors or board members who are willing to ask for money and are enthusiastic about your organization. Phone calls are the second most effective way of asking for money because, again, it includes that personal contact. It's really hard for people to say no when somebody's asking them directly. And for some board members and volunteers, asking for money over the phone is also easier than doing it in person. But again, you need to have those people. You need to have those board members or staff members or volunteers who are willing to do the asking, make the phone calls. And you need to have phone numbers for all your potential donors. And right now, people tend to be moving away from their landlines and towards all cell phone usage. So we maybe have a harder time now to get phone numbers for everybody the way, it was a lot easier in the past. Letter and online solicitations have the advantage of giving you the ability to reach a broader donor base. So instead of reaching 20 to 30 people with a phone call, you can reach 2,000 with a letter or an email. And these methods can also be a great way to tell your story and to target your audience and target your appeal. But both letter solicitation and online solicitations have a very low response rate. Usually only 2 to 4% of people respond to a letter mailing and an even a lower number to an online solicitation. So you need to have a large list in your database to mail to or to email to in order to get a significant return. The other way to reach and increase the number of individual donors that you have is through events. And everybody loves to add events to their fundraising plan. And events do have some advantages. They are a great way to attract new friends and potential donors and really increase the number of names and mailing addresses that you have in your database. And they're also a great way to get the word out about the program and its impact. Events are also a good way to raise a little bit of money. But for those of you who have ever worked on events, you'll know that they require a lot of lead time to work well. They require a lot of staff and volunteer time in both the planning and in the execution. And they have a lot of related expenses. You need to pay for food, for decorations, or for the venue, or you need to get that donated, and that takes a lot more time and connections. So events are an expensive way to raise a dollar, and they provide little bang for your buck. So I try and encourage people to keep events to a bare minimum when you're creating your fund development plan. So once you've decided on the right mix for your fundraising, a good individual giving program will include a program to steward your donors. You've attracted the donors to your organization, so now you want to build your relationships. And donor stewardships is how you build and maintain those relationships. And you do that because you want your individual donors to continue to give to your organization year to year, and you want those donations to grow. And donor relationships are built through a series of interactions over time. It's important that not all of these interactions are about asking for money. You want to keep your donors educated about your program and how they're impacting people in the community. But you also want to take an opportunity to learn more about your donors themselves. People will give to the things that interest them the most, and so you want to know what those interests are. So with your donors, especially that those have been with the organization for a long time or given at a larger level, you really want to make an effort to understand why they're interested in your program and what motivates them to give. And then you want to keep records of that so that you can refer back to it when you meet with them the next time. Your stewardship program should involve a blend of activities throughout the year. Phone calls and meetings can give you an opportunity to better understand the interests and motivations of your donors. You can use newsletters and e-blasts and personalized notes. And when it's possible and we're in person again, you can use tours to keep your donors informed about your programs and the impact that the programs are having in the community. And then remember to include timely thank yous, because those are especially important to make sure that your donors know that their contributions are appreciated and that they're having an impact on the people you serve. While we've given you some general examples of stewardship activities, we want to take a break for a minute and hear from the rest of the group about what your agency does as part of its stewardship program, even if you're not calling it that. How do you keep in touch with your donors and friends so you are building that relationship? Or what have you heard or what do you know that other organizations do that you think is especially effective? We're going to take a few minutes now and give you an opportunity to write your answers in the chat and then maybe share some of those with the group.
Okay, a question was posted that COVID has made it very difficult to do face-to-face meetings and asks. So the person wanted to know, what have others been doing in place of that? Are you doing virtual face-to-face meetings? So if people want to chat in about how you've replaced in-person meetings, or using masks, virtual, or doing something else.
Oh, and then somebody asked if this is there's a special way to respond. We're just asking you to actually use the chat function to share with us. So we're looking for new ideas. So yeah, please just chat into the chat box.
Someone suggested thankathons, postcards, or cards to say thank you to people. Phone calls from staff and volunteers. We've been meeting with people via Zoom, so some people are doing it virtual, direct solicitations and events. We'll take a few more minutes if anybody else wants to chat in anything you've been successful with, or if you have a question for your peers, we can call that out too.
And for those people who do have older donors who may be feeling a little bit more isolated right now, this is a great time to reach out to them. So maybe through Zoom, through notes, because they may be feeling a little bit more isolated than they have in the past.
Someone said they transitioned a fundraising dinner to a virtual event, and somebody else with personalized thank you cards and email messages. Someone else, newsletters, phone calls, board and staff make thank you calls, meeting with donors outside in parks or cafes, so do that quickly before the cold weather sets in. With my agency, we're using mask phone meetings and also virtual meetings. So some face-to-face with masks and phone calls and virtual meetings. Okay, so that's a Good list. Thank you all for sharing that. It's important that we share with each other. One more, we created 2 virtual events, one in July and one in October. So, okay, people are making that work. We're going to go back to our presentation now. And kind of a chaotic slide here, but there's a lot to fundraising. So once your team has worked through each of these steps, you've done your development audit, you've worked with your fundraising team to create your messages, you've set measurable and realistic fundraising goals, you've created what you consider to be an ideal fundraising mix to achieve those goals, and you've thought about your stewardship program. Now it's time to get this full fundraising plan down on paper. Just like with your strategic plan, your fund development plan should include some general organizational information, including your mission and vision and the strategic plan goals that are linked to the fund development plan. At the beginning of the plan, you also want to include your key messages or the case statement Jenny mentioned earlier that you created. This background focuses the team on why you're raising the funds. Next, you want to include the fundraising goals that you have set and the key strategies that you'll be using to achieve them. In this example, you can see that the goal is to increase the number of donors by 10%, and the methods used to achieve this include holding a community walk, co-sponsoring a violence prevention workshop, and creating a database to store names and addresses of program attendees so they can be added to the mailing list. The second example of a goal is to increase the visibility of the organization in the community. They're going to do that by creating a story bank of success stories, creating a quarterly newsletter, and using the website and presentations to share these success stories. Yeah. Your chart of funding sources is the piece of the plan in which you put on paper your fundraising mix and the actual dollar goals that you've set. This part of the plan should link directly to the organization's budget. So it's best if the fund development plan can be developed before the board goes through its budgeting process. The chart of funding sources includes both the overall funding mix and the specific events or appeal linked to that source. I also like to identify the key people involved and the target date for each of them, although Jenny will show us a more detailed fundraising calendar next.
The fundraising calendar is where we flesh out those deadlines that we had in our chart of funding sources. It will include the detailed steps for achieving each one of the strategies, and it'll give you a visual picture of where you might be bunching up too many activities in the same month. Remember, we've already talked about the fact that we might have limited staff and we may have a limited database of donors. So we want to make sure that the fundraising tasks and interactions are spread over the course of the full year and are not bunched into certain months. So in this, you can see that we've given you a small sample of a fundraising calendar. So this one only shows January through August, and yours will show all the way through December. But if you look at it, you can see that the activities related to putting out the newsletter are pretty well spread out and separate from those related to the May dinner. But if once we did this fundraising calendar, you saw that the invitation for the May dinner was going out in the mail the same month that the newsletter went out, then you might want to rethink the timing of one of those 2 events. So remember from our stewardship slide that you want to space out your interactions with your donors throughout the year. The final part of your fund development plan is your fundraising budget, and it's a really important part of the plan, so don't forget it. We're not going to talk about building a budget today because we will be doing a financial management workshop in a couple of months. But it's important to think through each individual cost for the items that you've included in your fundraising budget so that you're not caught unawares. So if you're doing a mailing, then you need to remember to budget for the stamps and the envelopes and the color printing if you're using your printer in-house. Because some methods of fundraising like events are much more expensive to implement than other methods, it's important that the budget reflect that. So that you really have an idea of the return on investment for each of the things that you've planned. And like with the chart of funding sources, this fundraising budget should feed into and match the organization budget for fundraising costs. And once you have the budget, then you'll have completed your fund development plan and you'll be ready to get your fundraising year underway. So we've covered a lot in the last 40 minutes. And so we want to give you a chance to give us a little bit of feedback. We'd love to have you answer the following poll question. And that is, based on what we've just covered, how ready do you think you are for fund development planning? And for some of you, this may have just been a review, and so you might already have a solid plan and you're on the right track. but you take a look. We've only given you 30 seconds, so I'm not going to read through the answers real quick and then answer. Let us know where you are. Are you going to start right away? Do you think you need a little bit more help to get started?
I got 10 seconds, so please check an answer and hit
We did
submit.
quick polls today, so you got to be quick on the click.
Okay, time's up. Rachel, you want to share the results?
Does take.
It takes 20 seconds for it to close, so it's just populating. Bear with me. I'm not sleeping on the job.
Yep. And one of the reasons we asked this question is because we're going to remind you in a minute of the training and technical assistance request program that will give us an opportunity to help. So only a few of you, only about half of you answered. And it looks like there were 5 of you that feel like you have a solid plan, and so you just need to tweak it a little bit. But 15 of you, I can't see the percentages, Alan, maybe you can, but 15 of 80 of you thought that you were right, you're on the right track. 10, another 10 are ready to go, and about 7 of you think you will need a lot of help to even get started on this. So for those of you who think that you need a little bit of help or that you are ready to start, we wanted to remind you that there is this training and technical request program, and we are able to provide coaching and training and consulting to OVS programs at no cost to them. So you can find out more information at the website that's listed here, but we do want to give you a couple of examples that are related directly to fund development planning to give you something to think about. So here are some sample projects. We can help you with your development audit by doing an analysis of your current resources and revenue streams, or helping you look at your current donor database and doing a donor audit for you. We can do some board development around creating the fund development plan. We can facilitate a fund development treat to help you work with your board to set those fundraising goals and help you think about new strategies. And we can help develop a template or do a review of your fundraising materials, such as direct mail letters or case statements. We can't actually do the writing of the letters or the case statements, but we certainly can give you the format for how they might work best. I'm going to turn it over to Blake in a minute to wrap up the webinar, or Rachel, I'm not sure who's wrapping up, but we're going to stay on and answer any questions you may have. So please write any questions in the chat box now, and we'll respond to them as best we can before we sign off. But you can also email us either with questions that you have or that you think of after we get off, or to find out more about the additional services we offer. And you can use that same calendar link that's earlier in the webinar if you want to if you'd rather set up a phone call with us and to talk about services. So do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, so thank you. A special thank you to Jenny and Alan for putting together today's webinar. You know, when we are going to stick around, do some Q&A, but when you do exit, don't forget to complete your evaluation survey, as we just mentioned. Again, it's a safe sender. You'll be redirected by your browser automatically. Takes 2 minutes. Give us all the feedback. We'd love it. This is a series of webinars coming up, so any feedback you give us now will directly be used to improve on our next few webinars that we do over the next couple months. Also, join us on the November 5th Engaging Your Board and Volunteers in Building Community Support webinar. So take a look at all of that. So before we officially sign off, we can...
Yeah, we'll give it a few minutes to see if any questions come through. So bear with us. We'll just go silent as people type in.
Yeah, and Alan and I are available to stay until noon. So if anybody, thinks of anything, we will stay on for a little while.
You mean 2?
Till 2.
Till 2? Oh, and I'm looking right at the clock. I was looking directly at the clock at 1:45 and I said.
Again, feel free to chat in, put it to all panelists so we can all see it. And any questions you have, we'd be happy to try to answer them. Okay, we had a couple of people saying thank you. We're glad this was helpful. Appreciate that feedback. And again, please do the evaluation to get a little bit more specific feedback.
Sometimes it can be overwhelming. So it's really just a thought of, what are the first steps? And the first step may be, talking to your board about it or thinking where you might want to, think about where you might want to start with the process.
One question came through that might be good for people that are on to also answer, but we were talking a bit about, COVID, we can't do in-person events as much. That's hard. People are zoomed out. So has anybody had any success in getting a feel of a face-to-face while we can't? We know that obviously in-person is best. We know that Zooms happen. But has anybody had any good interactions since COVID began that might be good for other people to use? Also, a question is the survey will pop up when you X out of, when you leave the event.
Yeah.
So if anybody has any thoughts about how to do face-to-face without doing Zoom. People are looking at Zoom for 6 months now, and it's not as exciting as it once was.
That's for sure.
And again, Jenny said we covered a lot of information in 45 minutes, and it's hard to absorb it all. So feel free to just email us or set up a phone call, and we're happy to just talk to you about maybe how you could begin, what would be a good place to start. You don't have to call us with the answer. It's fine to call us just with some questions.
Oh, thank you for that. We just got a few notes. So happy hour type virtual gatherings with certain groups was helpful. People felt that the ability to have it not be a money grab per se or a work meeting made it a bit more informal. Some donors have been open to outdoor mask distance interactions. It can be difficult because mask wearing it challenges, relationship building when you can't see facial expressions and cues. But that has worked for people while we still have a little bit of good weather left. And also phone conversations have actually become more useful when somebody just doesn't want to have their camera on and in their face anymore. Yeah. But yes, Zoom fatigue is a real thing. We had a few notes about that, which I totally understand.
Right, and there are some organizations that have been creative in kind of combining a virtual event, so really using email and phone apps to do some auctioning with just 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of a live event on Facebook. So it's not Zoom, people aren't on camera, but they can hear from the program, they can enjoy part of some sort of program. So it may be a sports related thing or a musical offering if it's fundraising for an arts organization. So just thinking about what you might do, for victim service agencies, that part of the event may be that awareness piece, really giving people an overview of your success stories and telling the story, but making it very short. So instead of a 2-hour event, really people are signing up for 10 or 15 minutes. Are there inexpensive or free donor management software? And there aren't, that's one thing that we could look into for people and get some information out there. I think one of the biggest challenges for organizations is finding software that does all of the things that you want it to do, and at a low cost. And there are more software packages now that you can at least, instead of buying, you used to have to buy a huge expensive package, and now you because of the online subscription model for software, there are now packages available where you can subscribe and pay $20 to $50 to $100 a month, depending on what you're using it for. But there's so it's less expensive in the short term. Long term you're paying every month, but that's a constant struggle for small organizations.
Someone shared that they did a volunteer online event that was basically 15 to 20 people playing trivia. It was a lot of fun. It built relationships and made for more fertile ground for individual asks for financial support in the future. And so sometimes it's just, especially, I think Jenny mentioned, if you have older people living alone, especially as we get back into winter, just reaching out, being a support to these, let them know that you haven't forgotten them, and then they won't forget you either. But you don't have to ask for money, each time you have that phone call. It's a lot about just building relationships, having some fun, offering some connection.
That's a great idea. I love that.
Yeah.
Should we start trivia at 2 o'clock?
I think so. Any final questions or comments? We'll give it another maybe minute or so to see if anything else comes through.
Okay, so I hope you'll take some time, and the handouts were available. Rachel put a link in. Do you want to maybe put that link back in, Rachel, at the end here if people want to grab it? Read through it, think about it. And again, it's okay to call us with just a vague question. You don't have to have something specific in mind. And we can talk about how we could be of assistance. There's the link in the chat box for the slides if you wanted to download them. They're also on the website, and the recording will be on the website as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Jenny and Alan, for all your help. And please don't forget to do your surveys and join us next month for our next webinar in the series. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a great day.
everyone.